The rain beat hard against my windshield while I cried from exhaustion. It wasn't the kind of crying that comes from sadness, exactly, but the kind that comes from a soul being slowly squeezed dry by the pressure of expectations. I sat there in the parking lot of the First Capital Bank of Dallas, gripping the leather steering wheel of a car I hadn't truly wanted, but felt obligated to buy to fit the part. The wipers were slapping back and forth, a rhythmic metronome counting down the seconds until I had to compose myself, fix my mascara, and walk into that glass fortress to do the one thing I had become terrifyingly good at, breaking people's hearts with a calculator. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of recycled air conditioning and expensive perfume, trying to drown out the phantom smell of wet earth and hay that used to define my childhood. I was a senior credit analyst now. I wasn't the little girl from a no-name town in West Texas anymore. I was the woman who decided who got to keep their dreams and whose dreams would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. My boss called me the Scalpel because I was precise, cold, and efficient. I took pride in that nickname, or at least I told myself I did. It was armor. It kept the world at a distance. Stepping out of the car, my high heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement, a sound that always reminded me of a clock ticking. I rushed through the revolving doors and into the lobby, instantly enveloped by the sterile chill of the bank. It was a temple of marble and chrome, designed to make you feel small, designed to make money feel like a god. The silence here was heavy, only broken by the hushed whispers of tellers and the hum of servers processing millions of dollars in invisible transactions. That was when I saw him. Not the man who would change my life. He was there too, but I didn't notice him yet. But the man I was scheduled to destroy, Mr. Miller. He was sitting on one of the sleek, uncomfortable modern chairs in the waiting area, looking like a relic from a museum that had been accidentally dropped into a spaceship. He was holding a straw hat against his chest, his knuckles white from gripping it so hard. His boots were old, the leather cracked and stained with the red dust of a land that was fighting a losing battle against the drought. Those boots didn't belong on this pristine Persian rug. They belonged in a stirrup or on the pedal of a tractor. Seeing him there, looking so small despite his broad shoulders, sent a jolt of irritation through me. Not because I hated him, but because he was a reminder of everything I had run away from. He was the ghost of my own father, the ghost of every struggle I thought I had outsmarted by moving to the city. I walked past him with my head held high, clutching my tablet like a shield. I didn't make eye contact. In this business, eye contact is a liability. If you look them in the eye, you start thinking about their families, their suppers, their prayers, and you can't foreclose on a prayer, you can only foreclose on an asset. I signaled the receptionist, a young woman who looked as tired as I felt, and she nodded, gesturing toward the glass-walled conference room known as the Fishbowl. Everyone could see in, but sound didn't escape. It was perfect for silent executions. As I organized my files on the mahogany table, preparing the foreclosure documents for the Miller Ranch, I glanced toward the back of the waiting area. There was another man there, sitting quietly in the corner, obscured by a large, open financial newspaper. He was wearing a black resistal hat pulled low, a clean, starched button-down shirt. He seemed out of place too, but in a different way. He didn't look desperate like Mr. Miller. He looked anchored, like a rock in a stream that the water just flows around. I assumed he was some high-net-worth rancher, waiting for a private wealth consultation, probably annoyed that the receptionist had double-booked the waiting area. I dismissed him. My focus had to be on the toxic asset sitting 20 feet away. Mr. Miller was ushered in. He walked with a slight limp, the kind you get after 40 years of jumping off truck beds and wrestling calves. He stood by the chair, waiting for permission to sit, his manners impeccable, a product of a time when respect was a currency more valuable than Bitcoin. "Please sit down, Mr. Miller," I said, my voice practiced and even. I didn't offer him water. I didn't ask about his drive. I went straight to the screen of my laptop. "We have a lot to get through today." He sat slowly, placing his hat on the empty chair next to him as if it were a companion. "Thank you, Mom," he said. His voice was like gravel and honey, rough but gentle. "I appreciate you seeing me. I know I'm a bit behind, but I brought the updated projections. The weatherman says the rain is coming next week. If we can just get the winter wheat in. I cut him off with a raised hand. It was a rude gesture, one I had learned from my superiors. Mr. Miller, I've reviewed the projections. I've reviewed the soil reports and the market analysis for cattle futures. The reality is that your operation has been insolvent for 3 consecutive quarters. The bank isn't looking at the weather forecast. We are looking at the debt-to-income ratio, and yours is unsustainable. The old man blinked as if I had slapped him. But, Ma'am, that land has been in the Miller family since 1895. My grandfather cleared those fields with a mule and a hand plow. We've survived the Dust Bowl. We survived the crash of the 80s. I'm not asking for a handout, I'm asking for time. Time is money, Mr. Miller, I recited, the corporate mantra tasting like ash in my mouth, and unfortunately, you're out of both. I slid the document across the table. It was the deed in lieu of foreclosure. It was a surrender. It was the end of his world, printed on standard letter-sized paper, font size 12. If you sign this today, we can avoid the sheriff coming out to the property. It allows for a dignified exit. You'll have 30 days to vacate the main house. 30 days to pack up 100 years of life, to pack up the memories of his wife, who I knew from the file had passed away 2 years ago, the event that likely started this financial spiral. He looked at the paper, and his hands started to shake. It wasn't a subtle tremble. It was the violent shaking of a man whose foundation was crumbling beneath him. I looked away. I looked out through the glass wall of the office, trying to find something neutral to focus on. My eyes landed on the man in the back of the waiting room again. He had lowered his newspaper slightly. He was watching us. Even from this distance and through the glass, I felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't judgmental exactly. It was piercing. It felt like he was reading the scene, not with eyes, but with a heart that knew exactly what was happening. He folded the newspaper slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the side table. I turned back to Mr. Miller. He had taken a pen from his pocket, a cheap plastic promotional pen from a feed store, and was hovering over the signature line. A single tear, heavy and silent, rolled down his cheek, navigating the deep crevices of his sun-beaten skin before dropping onto the pristine legal document. It left a small, dark circle on the paper. I felt a crack in my armor, just a hairline fracture. I remembered my own grandfather sitting at a kitchen table worrying about the cotton crop. I remembered the sound of him praying in the morning. I shoved the memory down. Emotions get you fired. Numbers keep you employed. Mr. Miller, I said, my voice softer than I intended, but still firm. It's the only way to stop the interest from compounding. It's the logical choice. Logical, he whispered, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a sorrow so deep it felt like looking into a well. Is it logical to erase a family? Is it logical to tell my grandkids that the place they learned to walk belongs to a corporation now? I didn't have an answer for that. The spreadsheet didn't have a column for heritage. Just as the tip of his pen touched the paper, the glass door to my office opened. It wasn't the receptionist, it wasn't my manager. The man from the waiting area walked in. He didn't rush. He moved with a slow, easy grace, the kind of walk that eats up miles without tiring. The sound of his boots on the hard floor was different from Mr. Miller's. It was authoritative, solid. He was wearing a crisp white shirt, a silver belt buckle that caught the fluorescent light, and that black hat. "Excuse me," I said, my corporate instincts kicking in. "This is a private meeting. You can't just walk in here." He ignored me. He didn't do it rudely. He just acted as if my protest was a buzzing fly that didn't need swatting. He walked straight up to the table, reached out a hand that looked like it had held as many guitar necks as it had reins, and gently placed his fingers over the document, covering the spot where Mr. Miller was about to sign. "Don't sign that, son," the stranger said. Mr. Miller looked up, confused, wiping his eyes with the back of his rough hand. The stranger turned to look at me then. Up close, the recognition hit me like a physical blow. The blue eyes, the slight grin that wasn't quite a smile, but held a world of knowing. The face that had been on the cover of every cassette tape in my father's truck. It was George Strait. My breath caught in my throat. I was paralyzed. This was the king of country music standing in my sterile, glass-walled office in downtown Dallas. He shouldn't be here. He should be on a stage, or on a horse, or anywhere but in the middle of a foreclosure meeting. "Mr. Strait," I stammered, my professional mask slipping completely. He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture so ingrained it seemed unconscious. "Mum, I apologize for interrupting your business. I was waiting for a meeting with your board of directors, but it seems I ended up in the wrong lobby. But I've been sitting out there watching this for 10 minutes. He looked down at Mr. Miller, who was staring at him with his mouth slightly open, recognizing the legend standing beside him. "I know this man," George said, his voice calm, steady, and filling the room with a warmth that the thermostat couldn't regulate. "Not personally, maybe, but I know him. I know the dirt under his fingernails. I know why his boots are cracked. And I know that look in his eye. That's not the look of a man who's given up. That's the look of a man who's been cornered." "Mr. Strait," I tried to regain control, my voice shaking. "This is a complex financial matter. Mr. Miller is in default. The bank has policies." "Policies?" George repeated the word thoughtfully, as if tasting it. He picked up the foreclosure document and looked at it with disdain. "You know, I've spent my life singing about heartache, about loving and losing, and about the land. And one thing I've learned is that you can't put a policy on a man's dignity." He looked me dead in the eye. I felt naked under that gaze. It wasn't angry, it was disappointed. It was the look of a father who knows his child can do better. "You're from around here, aren't you?" he asked. It wasn't a guess. "Yes," I whispered. "West Texas." "I thought so," he nodded. "I can hear it in your vowels when you forget to talk like a banker. You know what rain smells like on dry caliche. You know what it takes to keep a fence line straight. So, tell me, when did you stop seeing a neighbor and start seeing a number?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to talk about fiduciary duty and risk assessment, but the words died in my throat. I looked at Mr. Miller, really looked at him, for the first time. I saw the tremor in his hands not as weakness, but as the exhaustion of a fighter who has gone 12 rounds. George turned his attention back to the farmer. "What's your name, partner?" "Bill. Bill Miller," the old man croaked. "Well, Mr. Miller," George said, extending his hand, "I'm George, and I happen to be looking for an investment. I've got some capital sitting around doing nothing but making bankers happy, and I'd much rather it make some corn grow." He turned back to me, his expression hardening just a fraction. "Here is what we are going to do. You're going to tear that paper up." "I can't," I said, panic rising. "My boss, the system, it's already processed." George leaned in, placing both hands on the mahogany table. The contrast was striking, the polished wood against his working man's hands. "You can," he said softly. "Because if you don't, I'm going to walk into that boardroom upstairs and tell them that I'm pulling every dime I have out of this bank. And I'm going to tell them exactly why. I'm going to tell them that this bank has forgotten who feeds this country." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside the glass walls, the busy bank continued to hum, oblivious to the standoff happening inside. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was risking my career. I was risking everything I had built. But looking at George Strait and then looking at Mr. Miller, I realized that what I had built was a cage. But George wasn't done. He wasn't just there to write a check and leave. He wanted to teach a lesson. He wanted to save something more than just the land. "I'll cover his arrears," George said. "But I have a condition, and it involves you, miss." "Me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "You," he nodded. "You've been looking at this farm on a screen. I want you to go see it. I want you to drive Mr. Miller home today. I want you to walk that land with him. I want you to see what you were about to kill. If you come back on Monday and still think this is just a toxic asset, then I'll pay off the whole note and we'll never speak of it again. But you need to go get some mud on those fancy shoes." He challenged me. It wasn't a request, it was a dare. A dare to find the humanity I had buried under layers of corporate ambition. I looked at the foreclosure document. I looked at the pen. I looked at the rain still hammering against the window, washing the world clean. Slowly, with a hand that trembled just as much as Mr. Miller's had, I reached out and took the paper. I didn't sign it. I ripped it in half. The sound of the tearing paper was the loudest thing I had ever heard. George Strait smiled then. A real smile, it lit up the room. "Grab your coat," he said to me. "We've got a ride to take, and Bill here needs a lift." I stood up, my legs feeling weak. I was terrified of what my manager would say. I was terrified of the breach of protocol. But for the first time in years, the knot in my chest loosened. I wasn't the scalpel anymore. I was just a girl from West Texas who was about to take a drive with a legend and a man who had just gotten his life back. As we walked out of the office, heads turned. People whispered. But I didn't care about the bank employees anymore. I was walking beside George Strait, and for some reason, I felt like I was finally walking in the right direction. The walk from the glass doors of the bank to the parking lot felt like crossing a border between two warring nations. Inside, the air was still, conditioned, and smelled of money, crisp, dry, and lifeless. Outside, the Texas sky had opened up, unleashing a deluge that smelled of ozone, wet asphalt, and the distant metallic tang of lightning. I hesitated under the awning, clutching my purse against my chest. My car, a silver sedan chosen for its fuel efficiency and unassuming professionalism, was parked 3 rows away. But George Strait didn't walk toward the visitor lot. He walked toward a black Jubilee pickup truck parked right at the curb in a no-parking zone. A ticket fluttered under the wiper blade, soaking wet. George pulled it out, glanced at it, and shoved it into his pocket without a change in expression. "We'll take my truck," George said. It wasn't a question. "Your car won't make it up the washboard road to Bill's place in this weather, not with those tires." I looked down at my heels. Italian leather, 3 inches high, bought with my first bonus check. They were instruments of torture designed to signal power in a boardroom, but out here, facing the wrath of a Texas storm, they were ridiculous. "I can follow you," I suggested, my voice sounding thin against the roar of the rain. I was clinging to the last shred of my autonomy. If I got into that truck, I was no longer the senior credit analyst. I was just a passenger. George opened the passenger door. He didn't say a word. He just stood there holding the heavy metal door open, the rain darkening the shoulders of his shirt. He looked at me with that same patient, unyielding gaze. It was a look that said he had all the day in the world to wait for me to stop fighting reality. I lowered my head and climbed in. The cab of the truck was a different universe. It smelled of saddle soap, old coffee, and diesel. It was spacious, cluttered with the artifacts of a life lived on the road and on the ranch, a coil of rope on the floorboard, a stack of CDs on the dashboard, a pair of leather work gloves resting on the center console. Mr. Miller climbed into the back seat, moving with the stiff, pained grace of a man whose joints were grinding bone on bone. As George started the engine, the low rumble of the diesel vibrated through the seat, resonating in my chest. It felt powerful, alive. We pulled out into the traffic, leaving the towering glass monolith of the bank in the rearview mirror. I watched it shrink, feeling a strange sense of vertigo. That building was my identity. Without it, who was I? Just a woman in a stranger's truck, driving into a storm she had spent 10 years trying to outrun. For the first 20 minutes, silence reigned. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of an elevator. It was the heavy, contemplative silence of a church. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth, fighting the sheets of water. "You have a family, miss?" George asked suddenly. He didn't look at me. His eyes were scanning the slick highway. "No," I answered quickly. "I mean, my parents are in Lubbock, but I'm focused on my career right now." "Career," George repeated the word, testing its weight. "That's a heavy thing to be married to. It doesn't hug you back when you get home." "It pays the bills," I retorted, defensive. "It provides security." From the back seat, Mr. Miller spoke up. His voice was soft, barely audible over the hum of the tires. "My Martha used to say that security is a myth. The only real security is knowing your neighbors will come running if they see smoke rising from your barn." I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window, watching the suburbs give way to strip malls, and the strip malls give way to open fields. "I saw your file, Mr. Miller," I said, my voice softer now. "I know you lost her 2 years ago. I'm sorry." "The hospital bills were the first wave," he said, staring at the rain. "Then the funeral. Then the drought hit. It felt like the land was grieving with me. It just stopped giving. I sold the tractor, then the breeding stock. I cut every corner a man can cut without starving his dogs. But the math you folks do," he trailed off. "It doesn't account for grief. Interest rates don't pause for mourning. I gripped the door handle. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't personal, that it was just business. But sitting here, breathing the same air, sensing the heat radiating from these two men, the word business felt like a profanity. We turned off the highway onto a county road. The pavement turned rough, potholed and neglected. George handled the truck with an easy, one-handed competence. "You know," George said, breaking the silence again, "I've seen a lot of people like you in the music business, executives. They look at a song and they count the beats per minute. They analyze the demographic. They try to manufacture a hit. But you can't manufacture a soul. You can't put a price tag on the way a fiddle makes you cry." He glanced at me. "You're treating this man's life like a bad song you want to skip, but you haven't even listened to the lyrics yet." "I have a fiduciary duty," I argued, though the conviction was draining out of me. If I approve a loan that goes bad, it affects the bank's liquidity. It affects other borrowers. "And if you crush a good man," George countered, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as granite, "what does that do to your soul? What's the liquidity of your conscience?" I turned away, staring out the window. The landscape had changed. We were in the deep country now. The fields were brown and grey, thirsty, desperate. The rain was falling, but it looked like it was bouncing off the hard-packed earth rather than soaking in. It was a harsh, unforgiving beauty. "Turn here," Mr. Miller said. George swung the truck onto a dirt track. Immediately, the vehicle slid slightly as the tires fought for purchase in the thick, red mud. We bounced violently. My purse slid off my lap. This wasn't a driveway, it was a wound in the earth. We crested a small hill, and there it was, the Miller homestead. The Miller. It wasn't the derelict shack I had imagined from the aerial photos in the file. It was a modest, white clapboard farmhouse with a wraparound porch. It needed paint, badly. Some of the shingles were missing. The fence leaning against the side of the barn was broken, but there were flower pots on the porch, empty now but arranged with care. There was a swing. There was a life here. George killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was deafening, filled only by the drumming of rain on the metal roof. "We're here," George said. "End of the line for the bank. Start of the line for the truth." He opened his door and stepped out into the mud. He didn't run for cover. He stood there, adjusting his hat, waiting. I opened my door. The smell hit me instantly. Wet sage, damp earth, cattle manure, and the sweet, rotting scent of old hay. It was the smell of my childhood. It triggered a memory so vivid it made me dizzy. My father coming home, smelling exactly like this, lifting me up and spinning me around before the bank took our farm when I was 12. I stepped down. My heel sank immediately into the muck, the mud oozing over the expensive Italian leather, ruining the shoe instantly. I gasped, instinctively trying to pull my foot back, but the mud held fast. "Leave the shoes," George called out from the front of the truck. He wasn't mocking me, he was serious. "You can't walk this land in those stilts." I looked at him, then at Mr. Miller, who was struggling to get out of the back seat. I kicked off the shoes. I stepped into the cold, squelching mud in my stocking feet. The cold seeped through the nylon instantly, shocking my system. It felt grounding. For the first time in years, I was actually touching the earth. We walked up to the porch. Mr. Miller fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking. He opened the door and ushered us in. The interior was dim. He hadn't turned the lights on, probably to save electricity. The house was clean, impeccably so, but threadbare. The rug was worn through to the floorboards in the center. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, but the walls were covered in framed photos. I walked over to the mantel. There were photos of children, graduations, weddings, and in the center a black and white photo of a young Mr. Miller standing next to a beautiful woman, both of them laughing, leaning against a brand new tractor. They looked like movie stars. They looked invincible. "That was 1974, Mr. Miller said, standing beside me. "First year we turned a real profit. We thought we owned the world." "She was beautiful," I whispered. "She was the steel in my spine," he replied. "When she got sick, the insurance didn't cover the experimental treatments. I had a choice. I could keep the savings account intact, or I could buy her 3 more months of life." He looked at me, his eyes wet. "I bought the 3 months. We spent every afternoon on this porch. We talked. We remembered. Those 3 months were worth more than every acre of this ranch. That's why the numbers are red, ma'am. I spent my gold on time. I felt a lump in my throat so large I couldn't swallow. I had marked those withdrawals as irresponsible personal spending in my report. I had judged him for buying time with his dying wife. "Come on," George said from the doorway. He hadn't come inside to look at pictures. "The rain's letting up. I want to see the north pasture." "Mr. Strait, it's a mud pit out there," Mr. Miller warned. "I know," George said, "and she needs to see it." He pointed at me. I followed them out the back door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the world was soaked. We walked past the barn, past the empty silos. My feet were numb. My suit was splattered with mud. My hair was plastered to my skull. I looked like a disaster. I felt like I was waking up. We reached the edge of the field. It was a vast expanse of brown stalks, withered and dead. The drought had killed the winter wheat before it even had a chance. George stopped and crouched down. He ignored the mud staining the knees of his jeans. He dug his hand into the earth and pulled up a clump of soil. He crumbled it in his fingers. "Look at this," George commanded. I crouched down beside him. My skirt soaked up the water from the tall grass. I didn't care. "It's dead," I said. "That's what the report says. 0 yield." "No," George said, shaking his head. He grabbed my hand. His grip was rough, warm, and calloused, and forced my fingers into the dirt. "Feel that?" I felt the grit. But underneath the surface mud, the earth was hard, compacted. "The top is wet," George explained, "but underneath the roots are choked. This land has been worked too hard, too fast, trying to pay off your interest rates. It needs to rest. It needs to breathe. But you banks, you demand a harvest every season. You don't let the land sleep." He looked at me, his blue eyes piercing through the gray afternoon. "You're doing the same thing to yourself, aren't you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I pulled my hand back. "What?" "You," George said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're tight. You're hard. You're compacted. You're trying to produce, being the best analyst, being the toughest woman in the room. But look at you. You're shaking." I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. "You're scared," George continued, his voice softening. "You're scared that if you stop running, if you stop counting, you'll realize you're empty. You're just like this field. If you don't get some grace soon, you're going to turn to dust." I'm just doing my job," I stammered, tears mixing with the rain on my face. "Is this the job you dreamed of when you were a little girl?" George asked. "Did you dream of taking homes away from old men? Or did you dream of something else?" I looked at Mr. Miller. He was standing a few feet away, looking out at his broken field, with a look of such profound love that it broke my heart. He loved this dead dirt. He loved the struggle, because it was his. "I wanted to be a veterinarian," I whispered, a confession I hadn't made in 20 years. "I wanted to save things." "Then start now," George said. He gestured to the field, to the house, to the old man. "You have the power, you have the pen. You can write a report that destroys this, or you can write a report that saves it. You know the loopholes. You know the restructuring clauses. I can pay the money, sure, but that doesn't fix the system. You have to fix it. You have to decide whose side you're on, the algorithm or the human." I stood there in the mud, shivering. The cold was biting, but inside a fire was starting to kindle. I looked at the soil on my hands. It wasn't dirt. It was potential. "The bank will fire me," I said. It was a statement of fact. George smiled, that crooked, knowing smile. "Darling, if you save this farm and they fire you for it, that'll be the best thing that ever happened to you. But I have a feeling they won't. I have a feeling that if you walk in there with the backing of George Strait and a plan that actually makes sense, they'll listen. But you have to believe in it. You can't sell a lie. Do you believe this land can come back?" I looked at the field again. I saw the way the water was finally beginning to pool, soaking in. I saw the resilience of the weeds pushing through. I saw Mr. Miller's face. "Yes," I said. And for the first time that day, I wasn't lying. "Yes, I believe it." "Good," George said. He turned back toward the truck. "Now let's get out of this rain before we all catch pneumonia." I think Bill here has some coffee on the stove, and we have a lot of paperwork to rewrite. As we walked back to the house, I didn't try to avoid the puddles, I walked right through them. The mud was heavy on my feet, but my spirit felt lighter than air. I was cold, wet, and a mess. But as I climbed onto the porch and looked back at the field, I realized I had never seen anything so beautiful. The real storm was over. The healing was about to begin. We sat at Mr. Miller's kitchen table until the sun went down. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt cleansed, heavy with the promise of new growth. The kitchen was warm now, heated by an old cast-iron stove, and the smell of strong black coffee that Mr. Miller had brewed in a percolator that looked older than me. I wasn't the senior credit analyst anymore. I was a strategist in a war room. My expensive blazer was draped over a chair to dry, stiff with mud. My hair was pulled back in a messy bun, no longer the sleek, intimidating helmet I wore to the office. I had a yellow legal pad in front of me, borrowed from Mr. Miller's desk, and I was writing furiously. George sat across from me, his hat on the table, watching me work. He didn't interrupt, he just sipped his coffee, his presence a steady anchor in the room. "The debt-to-income ratio is the killer," I muttered, chewing on the end of a pencil. "But if we reclassify the loan under the Agricultural Resilience Act of 2018, and if we use the projected yield of the winter wheat as collateral for a bridge loan instead of a foreclosure trigger," I looked up. "Mr. Strait, if you act as the guarantor, we can lower the risk profile from toxic to grade A. That drops the interest rate by 4 points. It cuts the monthly payment in half." George nodded slowly. "I told you, darling, I'm good for it. But the bank needs to accept the restructure. They want the land. Developers have been eyeing this county for months." "They want the asset," I corrected him, my voice gaining strength. "But they also want to avoid a PR nightmare. Foreclosing on a fourth-generation farmer is bad. Foreclosing on a farmer backed by George Strait, that's a catastrophe." I looked at Mr. Miller. He was asleep in his armchair in the corner, exhausted by the emotional toll of the day. He looked peaceful for the first time since I met him. "We go in on Monday," I said, looking George in the eye. "But we don't go in begging. We go in dictating terms." George smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just seen a calf stand up for the first time. "Now you're talking like a Texan again." Monday morning arrived with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was crisp, scrubbed clean by the storm. I parked my car, the sensible sedan, in the bank's garage. But when I stepped out, I wasn't wearing my Italian heels. I had thrown them in the trash on Sunday night. I was wearing a pair of boots. They were new, bought at a feed store on the way back to the city, but they were sturdy, practical. They grounded me. I walked into the lobby. The security guard, who usually ignored me, did a double take. I wasn't walking with the hurried, frantic pace of the scalpel. I was walking with a stride I had relearned in the mud. I took the elevator to the top floor. The boardroom. My boss, Mr. Henderson, was already there. He was a man made of starch and anxiety, constantly checking stock tickers on his phone. 2 other board members were present, along with the bank's legal counsel. They were expecting a deed. They were expecting a signature. "You're late," Henderson snapped without looking up. "And you look different. Did you get the Miller file closed? The developers are calling me every hour." I placed my briefcase on the long, polished table. I didn't sit down. "The Miller file is closed," I said calmly, "but not the way you think." Henderson looked up, his eyes narrowing behind his rimless glasses. "What does that mean? Do we have the deed or not?" "We don't have the deed," I said, "and we aren't getting it. I've restructured the loan." The room went silent. The lawyer chuckled, a dry, condescending sound. "You don't have the authority to restructure a toxic asset, young lady. That requires a guarantor with liquidity exceeding $5 million and board approval." "I have the guarantor," I said. "Who?" Henderson sneered. "Did Miller find a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow?" "No," a voice said from the doorway. "He found a neighbor." The doors swung open. George Strait walked in. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a stage outfit. He was wearing jeans, a sport coat, and that black hat, but he filled the room instantly. The air pressure seemed to change. Henderson's jaw literally dropped. The lawyer stopped clicking his pen. George walked to the head of the table, pulled out a chair and sat down as if he owned the building. He placed his hat on the table, a breach of boardroom etiquette that felt like a power move. "Gentlemen," George said, his voice smooth and low, "I believe you know who I am, and I believe you know that my credit is good." Henderson stammered, standing up. Mr. Strait, it's an honor. We had no idea. We didn't know you were involved in the Miller estate." "I am now," George said. He pointed a finger at me. "She explained the math to me. It seems you boys have been trying to squeeze blood from a stone when you should have been helping the stone become a foundation. She has a plan. I suggest you listen to it." I opened my folder. My hands didn't shake, not even a little. "Here is the new amortization schedule," I began, sliding the papers down the table. "Mr. Strait is putting up the collateral to cover the arrears. The interest rate drops to prime +1. The principal payments are deferred until after the harvest. This turns a non-performing asset into a performing loan within 30 days. The bank makes money, Mr. Miller keeps his home, and Mr. Strait doesn't pull his entire portfolio from this institution and tell the press why." I let the threat hang there. It wasn't subtle. It was a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. Henderson looked at the papers, then at George, then at me. He was pale. He realized he had been outmaneuvered. He realized that the scalpel had just performed surgery on his own arrogance. "This is highly irregular," the lawyer muttered, though he was already reaching for his pen. "Life is irregular," George said, leaning back. "Farming is irregular. It relies on rain and God, two things you can't put in a spreadsheet. Sign the papers, boys. I've got a tea time at 1. They signed. It took 20 minutes of furious stamping and legal review, but they signed. When we walked out of the boardroom, Henderson followed me into the hallway. He looked small, defeated, but also confused. "So you know this kills your promotion track," he hissed. "You went over my head. You brought in a celebrity to strong-arm the board. You're a liability now." I stopped and looked at him. I looked at the grey walls, the fluorescent lights, the cage I had spent 10 years building for myself. "I'm not a liability, Mr. Henderson," I said, smiling. "I'm a human being, and I quit." I turned around and walked away. I didn't pack my desk. I didn't say goodbye to the receptionist. I just walked out the front door into the Texas sun, where George Strait was leaning against his truck, waiting for me. "You quit," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I did," I exhaled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized was crushing me. "I don't know what I'm going to do. I have a mortgage. I have car payments." George opened the truck door. "Well, Bill needs help with the bookkeeping. He can't pay much, but the coffee is free. And I happen to know a few folks in the agricultural grant department in Austin who need someone who knows how to talk to bankers without becoming one." He tipped his hat. "You did good today, kid. You didn't just save a farm, you saved yourself." The sun was setting over the Miller Ranch, painting the sky in streaks of purple and burnt orange. The air was thick with the smell of sweetgrass and dust, the perfume of a successful harvest. I sat on the porch swing, the same one where Mr. Miller used to sit with his wife. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt covered in dust from a day spent inspecting irrigation lines. Mr. Miller came out of the house carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He moved slower now, his limp a little more pronounced, but his eyes were bright. He was alive. The farm was alive. "Mail came," he said, handing me a letter. I opened it. It was a check from the co-op. The winter wheat had sold at a record high. The farm was finally completely in the black. "We did it, Bill," I said, tears pricking my eyes. "It's paid off. The last of the restructuring loan." He smiled, sitting down in the rocking chair beside me. "We did it. You did it." "We had help," I reminded him. We both looked out at the driveway. We hadn't seen George in a few years. He was busy touring, busy being the king, but every Christmas, a card arrived. "No money, just a card. Keep it between the ditches," it would say. I had taken George's advice. I started a small consultancy firm for family farms. I helped them fight the banks. I helped them find grants. I became the shield I wished my father had. I wasn't rich. I drove a truck now, and my nails were never clean. But I slept at night. I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who knows exactly who they are. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the golden fields swaying in the wind. I could almost hear a melody in the rustling of the wheat. That day in the rain, crying in my car, I thought my life was falling apart. I didn't know it was just falling into place. I didn't know that a cowboy with a guitar and a quiet voice was going to show me that the most important currency in the world isn't printed by a government. It's printed on the heart. It's the willingness to stop, to look a stranger in the eye and say, "I've got you." I took a sip of the tea, the ice clinking against the glass. Somewhere in the distance a radio was playing. It was him. It was George, singing about Amarillo, about morning coming, about the enduring spirit of the land. I closed my eyes and let the music wash over me. I wasn't the scalpel anymore, I was the healer. And for the first time in my life, I was home,